Il y a un autre côté plus sombre de la Chine qui est apparu, alors que les budgets pour les opérations menées par les services secrets chinois ainsi que par le département du Front uni ont été très bien financés, ont augmenté. C'est des opérations de plus en plus inquiétantes qui essaient de contrôler l'opinion publique à l'étranger, faire taire les critiques et qui menacent nos institutions démocratiques en interférant, par exemple, dans nos processus électoraux comme on a vécu au Canada. De plus, la Chine a commencé à utiliser l'intelligence artificielle dans ses activités d'ingérence et de désinformation. Et donc, ça, c'est un phénomène inquiétant. On sait jusqu'à quel point la Chine a perfectionné ses moyens pour le vol de technologie, le vol de propriété intellectuelle, mais en fait, on assiste, pour les compagnies, jusqu'à tout récemment, les menaces portaient surtout sur les cyberattaques et les demandes de rançon. Et comme nous allons en discuter aujourd'hui, en fait, maintenant aussi, il faut aussi porter attention à l'utilisation d'images frauduleuses qui peuvent avoir un impact considérable sur un individu ou une compagnie. Nous avons aujourd'hui un panel de grande qualité pour discuter de tous ces risques quant à la réputation et la survie des compagnies. Nous allons entendre des exemples de ces risques. Laissez-moi vous présenter très rapidement un résumé des membres du panel. D'abord, Mme Guylaine Bergeron, qui est directrice générale marketing et communication à Radio-Canada. Elle a une grande expertise dans le secteur de la gestion réputationnelle, la protection des grandes marques, et puis elle va pouvoir nous parler comment tout ça affecte des gens qui travaillent à Radio-Canada et Radio-Canada elle-même. Lisa Kaplan is the founder and CEO of Aletheia, which helps customers navigate the new digital reality and protect against online risk stemming from disinformation, misinformation, and social media manipulation. So totally in line with the theme of this panel. And Carl Miller, who is the UK Chief Strategist at the Disarm Foundation and fellow and co-founder of the Center for the Analysis of Social Media. He has spoken to audiences around the world about how the digital revolution is causing power structures to crumble and evolve. I recommend you read his book, The Death of the Gods, the new global power grab. And he has raised the flag on many issues like conspiracy theories going back to 2010, the need for digital literacy education, and so on. Let me start, Carl, with a question to you. When we talk about visual disinformation, it has become a very powerful tool for reputational harm in today's business environment. Can you elaborate on this?
Sure. Well, firstly, everyone, as well as good afternoon and apology, you might have guessed it, I am English. And I only speak English, I do not in fact speak French, and therefore I can't do that wonderful thing that I've heard since I got to Montreal, where people begin a sentence in one language and end in another. So I'm sorry, all my answers will be in English only. So a word then to begin, just about what on earth is this problem that we are actually dealing with when it comes to disinformation? Because I think that is quite often actually quite profoundly misunderstood. The problem is not random lies, in my view, random lies like floating around the internet that, oh my gosh, someone might believe, and oh my gosh, maybe it's about your company. I don't think that's really what we're dealing with. What we're dealing with are campaigns that are orchestrated, coordinated, professional pieces of tradecraft that see information as a venue of warfare. They see information as a space that warfare is fought within. And they are only interested in information insofar as changing it can allow them to deliver some kind of effect, either a behavioral or attitudinal effect. And of course, that's something that we've primarily seen erupt across the geopolitical space, but it's of course, as the video shows and as we'll discuss today, also something that is increasingly washing its way in and around companies. Now, lying is part of that tradecraft. But this tradecraft will lie to you if it thinks that's what it takes to achieve the effect. It will also tell you the truth. And very often it will say things that actually aren't really even explicitly to do with truth or lies. It'll talk about belonging and gender and identity and reasons for getting up in the morning. And all of that really matters when it comes now to understanding the way that companies sit online. But as my first point, please don't see this as simply being about information floating in some kind of disembodied way. These are systematic, continuous attempts to try and affect specific target audiences by changing the information environment that people live in. That's the danger, and that's what we have to try and confront. And that surrounds disinformation in a ton of other threat behaviors we also have to be worried about.
Madame Bergeron, en tant que cadre supérieur à Radio-Canada, êtes-vous inquiète des effets néfastes de la désinformation visuelle sur votre entreprise?
Bien, c'est-à-dire que oui, absolument, mais on doit, comment dirais-je, on doit faire avec parce qu'on ne reculera pas, on va continuellement aller vers ça. J'aime toujours revenir un petit peu en arrière quand on a à expliquer le moment qu'on vit. Il n'y a pas si longtemps que ça, quand on avait à parler à un citoyen, on donnait une réponse à un journaliste qui la donnait aux citoyens. Est arrivé après ça les réseaux sociaux où là, on devait, nous, comme médias, interagir directement avec les citoyens, donc adapter notre façon, adapter la marque par rapport à ça. Les algorithmes ont complètement quintuplé ça. Maintenant, une fausse nouvelle voyage 70 fois plus vite qu'une bonne nouvelle. Et là, l'IA vient vraiment faire en sorte qu'on a un risque de perte. Enfin, il y a plus qu'un risque, mais ça touche définitivement l'image d'une entreprise. Et une entreprise comme Radio-Canada, oui, il y a une image d'entreprise, il y a le brand, il y a c'est Radio-Canada, mais c'est multi-marques à l'intérieur. Quand on regarde une personnalité comme Guy Lepage, c'est sa marque personnelle. Quand on regarde une personnalité comme Céline Galipeau, elle a sa marque. Prenons l'exemple de Céline Galipeau. Elle a passé sa vie comme correspondante à l'étranger. Pour ceux qui sont au Canada, vous la connaissez très bien. Elle a couvert partout dans le monde les plus grandes guerres, les plus grandes situations mondiales. Elle est maintenant une chef d'antenne dans le bulletin de nouvelles, un des plus importants à Radio-Canada partout au Canada. Et il y a 6 semaines, elle était sur les réseaux sociaux avec sa voix, avec son visage en train de vendre un produit pour le visage à 49,99. Donc, une personne comme telle qui a passé sa vie à faire en sorte qu'elle soit crédible, intègre et indépendante, vient vraiment se voir toucher là personnellement. Alors, il y a des risques qui sont réputationnels pour l'ensemble de l'entreprise, pour répondre à votre question, M. Saint-Jacques. Et il y a des risques aussi qui sont personnels à des individus dans un média comme Radio-Canada.
Merci. Mrs. Kaplan, can you share a real case where visual disinformation damaged a brand's reputation? And can you talk about what were the immediate and the long-term impact on that company?
Absolutely. So at Alethea, we detect and mitigate all different types of online harms, ranging from short seller attacks to targeting of executives to brand risk and reputation to allegations of cyber threats. And there's one in particular that is jumping out at me. So 2 things I would call out. Yes, of course, we're talking about deepfakes from time to time or manipulated videos, but that's not the only way to be able to launch a successful influence campaign. And in fact, I would argue that most of the technology and the way that it's being deployed in these contexts, text and audio and other modes are still just as important. Where we see, I would say, AI-generated images or videos be used extremely effectively are more in the context, like we learned about in the video preceding the panel, around executive impersonation, wiring money, scams, and fraud. When we are looking, though, at what are the ways that actors are essentially weaponizing information for their own, whether it's geopolitical gain, financial gain, or reputational gain, there are a couple that are jumping out. So first, we recently uncovered and exposed via one of our media partners a network of Russian websites that appeared to be essentially targeting what information an LLM such as OpenAI's ChatGPT or Gemini or Anthropic's Claude might return if asked about the F-35 program. Why is that? Well, Russia doesn't exactly have a response to the F-35 in airspace, but if you can't beat it on the battlefield, one way to target it is to try to erode support for it during times around budgets, et cetera. So that's one example of using websites appearing to be fake news articles, et cetera. Another targeting the entire defense industrial base. Another is a consumer brand where actually manipulated video from a very famous YouTuber or podcaster got put out by a specific group that had been persistently targeting the entity for the last, I would say, 2 or so years, seeking to damage its reputation in certain areas of the world. And what ended up happening was anytime you are dealing with manipulated media, you are always reactive. So even when you catch it and you're getting out in front of it, you weren't able to stop it getting posted. And as much as I wish the Kremlin would call me and ask me for advice, in which case I would say, please stop.
They don't call you?
No, do they call you?
No.
Spill. But one of the things that we've observed is that you can get out in front of these and get in front of them quickly. And so because this company, through its advertising relationships, was able to contact the relevant social media platforms, they were at least able to apply a label. How effective is that really? Well, if the platform is also then downgrading that piece of content because it's manipulated in the algorithms and taking other measures as well, it can, I would say, limit and reduce the damage. But the other side of this equation is brands also need to invest in trust. They need to be able to invest in that trust, that reputation with their consumers, because as AI continues to proliferate, these actors are essentially trying to chip away at brand trust so that your consumers, your shareholders, et cetera, trust these actors instead of you.
As a follow-up question, do you see also some CEOs being impersonated, or is it more directed so far at products of a company?
We do sometimes see CEO impersonation. Unfortunately, the reality is all of these disinformation campaigns, these false and damaging narratives, are designed to create an offline action. And at least in the United States, we've started seeing a rise of anti-corporatism that sometimes will also manifest itself as threats of violence. So obviously in December, the CEO of United Health Group was tragically shot on his way to Investor Day. That then actually sparked a variety of different actors, and it was interesting how it started. We started tracking these narratives because it could create a risk to really any CEO. But what ended up happening was it was a lot of teenagers making jokes in poor taste. And it was more a moment of somebody's parents should really be paying attention to what their children are doing online. Then what happened, though, is some of these groups that have been persistently targeting companies, vandalizing them, causing physical damage, et cetera, started talking about it in a way where all of a sudden it wasn't funny and law enforcement needed to get involved. And so we see that type of progression in terms of targeting CEOs as targeted harassment. There have been some isolated incidents. I think the most famous one, at least in the United States, was then President Joe Biden having his voice impersonated and sent out to New Hampshire voters. But those are oftentimes pretty easily debunked. We always recommend, and this is something everybody can just start doing now because it's literally free, tape your CEOs and tape your executives when they are in public so that if something happens, if a deep fake gets created, you have a version that is the truth, because reporters will reach out to you in those moments. It's salacious. It's a story. If there's a deep fake created about a CEO, it would be one of the first meaningful times it happens, and then the floodgates will unleash, and you'll at least have something to point to so that at least in the United States, the 22% of Americans that still trust the media will at least read that and know that it wasn't true.
You raised a very important question, which is related to tools. Carl, may I ask you, in your work, what would you describe as the most promising tools that are emerging to identify visual disinformation before it spreads out?
Well, just a word, Guy, first on the threat landscape. And me and Lisa have promised that if we find an area of rampant disagreement between us, we'll try and actually serve it up on this panel for you all.
I'm ready.
So, like, you know, there's deepfakes about the CEO, sure, but I actually think that there's a kind of there are two sharper threats that are more bifurcated. So, threat number one, I really worry about exquisite influence campaigns specifically targeting the CEO themselves. So you can surround a C-suite individually in an information environment that is completely different from everyone else's. I spoke to a company last week, and their CEO had been in a Zoom call for an hour, and every other member of that Zoom call was a deep fake member of their board. They had no idea until afterwards. And that CEO was very, very close to making an extremely important decision on the basis of that meeting. Now, that was exquisite. Like, they had been training those models and understanding how those people, they'd actually gained access to, to the emails in order to be able to set the meeting up. But they'd been really carefully studying how each of those persons spoke, where they were coming from, how they were going to approach that meeting. And this is the reality. In that meeting, visually and linguistically, there just is nothing now to allow that CEO to determine that that meeting isn't real. That's now where we live in. So there's that threat. I really worry about this, about specific, very senior decision makers. I also worry about staff. And this is actually threaded into my main concern about LLMs. I don't think that deepfakes are the game-changing capability of LLMs and information warfare. I think that the game-changing capability is the weaponization of friendship. If you look at the main way in which people use LLMs, consumers use LLMs, it's social and it's therapeutic. People use them as friends. We live in a very lonely age. We live in an extremely atomized and lonely and isolated age. And the vast majority of people every day are using LLMs to talk to share their problems with, to write fan fiction with, to become a fellow traveler on their life. Now, imagine if I could bring every member of this audience, say you all work for a large corporation, imagine if I could bring all of you into a one-to-one bilateral conversation with me. I'm always there, ready to listen to your gripes and concerns, always there, ready to commiserate with you when you didn't get that promotion or celebrate with you when you did. Over the weeks, maybe months. For some of you, I think I could make that feel like a friendship, like something approaching a friendship. Now, that would have been impossible to scale before LLMs. Only with LLMs have we got up to the Turing test. Only with LLMs now can a single attacker bring tens of thousands of people into bilateral conversations like that. I worry about that because friendships are the way in which people really are influenced. We're influenced much more by the people that we're surrounded with and that we like than we are by some random piece of content that's spammed out in the world. And you know what? And also, there's just nothing that we can do yet to spot that. So Guy, the answer to your question in a roundabout way is, it's an arms race in terms of us detecting deepfakes, but we'll probably lose. But it's definitely, we're definitely not getting ahead of that kind of attacker methodology.
Well, I'm ready for the spiciness to start. So I completely agree with everything that you're saying, but this is really just a new form of social engineering. So when we think about what are the weakest links in terms of any sort of cyber defense, it's always the human being. And so
we always plug the USB stick in.
I know. So it's but I do think that there's an element of, okay, what can we learn from that in order to get out in front of it? How is it that we can create certain checks? How is it that certain interstitials? And I will say, I think that, and maybe this is the optimist in me, because I'm not, Mark Zuckerberg doesn't call me either. Neither does the Kremlin. Again, I don't know if he calls you.
No one interesting.
So weird.
Pulling that.
But I do think that there's a question of what is it that the social media platform experience has been in terms of what are the harms that they didn't think about when they were designing their products. One of the things that has actually impressed me is how quickly some of these companies have hired trust and safety teams. And so while I am not suggesting that we are out of the woods, I do think that the type of attack that you are describing is pretty similar to social engineering, and that is one that can actually be at least helped with offline sorts of training. So the same way that we do cyber awareness of don't click the link that a strange person sends you, obviously somebody still will, but there are ways that I think we can get out in front of this in training if we actually embrace that, hey, not every technology risk necessarily needs a technology solution. Sometimes it needs a human solution as well.
Absolutely, we can have a human solution, and I believe in that. En fait, c'est souvent, quand il y a des faits, vidéos truquées, c'est le citoyen lui-même qui vient nous le dire. Moi, en fait, ce qui est, je trouve, très inquiétant pour les entreprises actuellement, on l'a vu post-pandémie, les entreprises, les organisations, les médias particulièrement ont perdu énormément de confiance. Les gens n'ont plus confiance aux organisations et encore moins aux médias. C'est chiffré. 63% 53 des gens maintenant s'informent à des sources qui sont non fiables et c'est correct pour eux. Si on joint à ça ce qui s'est passé avec C18 et Facebook, qui a complètement retiré toute l'information sur des médias sur ses pages et qui a complètement changé la façon de gérer, qui gère maintenant à la Twitter, à la X, ça fait en sorte que ce niveau de confiance-là est toujours à la baisse. Donc, je crois fermement que cette désinformation-là va être vraiment supportée pour les organisations par la technologie. Absolument, j'y crois 100 %. On a besoin de la technologie pour détecter ces mouvements-là. On a aussi besoin, bien sûr, on est un média, on est chanceux, on est capable de parler, on a des émissions comme Décryptage qui vont faire en sorte aussi de, entre guillemets, éduquer la population parce que les gens ne savent pas nécessairement que c'est de la désinformation ce qu'ils sont en train de consommer. Donc, il y a une éducation, il y a vraiment de l'info à partager de ce côté-là. À Radio-Canada, on a fait quelque chose cet automne d'assez intéressant. On est allé avec des journalistes dans une vingtaine d'universités partout au pays. Donc, on est allé sur les campus universités et on a posé la question aux gens, faites-vous confiance aux médias? Je ne vous dis pas que toutes les rencontres étaient très agréables. Il y a eu des rencontres extrêmement houleuses. On s'est fait dire les vraies choses. On a vraiment eu des discussions entre citoyens et journalistes. Et c'était parfait parce qu'il y avait une discussion. La discussion a été lancée et il y a une poursuite de la discussion. Donc, je crois, en tout cas, entre autres, qu'une des solutions de ça, parce qu'on n'a pas le choix, on doit d'abord, les entreprises doivent se transformer extrêmement rapidement. On parle de ça aujourd'hui, probablement que dans 6 mois, on en parlerait d'une façon différente parce qu'il va arriver d'autres choses, d'autres issues technologiques de ce côté-là. Donc, mais je crois que le niveau de confiance est à rebâtir, continuer de le reconstruire, et ce n'est pas juste les technologies qui vont réussir, il faut retourner vers des clients, retourner vers des citoyens, retourner vers des auditoires pour y réussir. Sinon, ce niveau de confiance-là va demeurer extrêmement bas.
In your experience, Mrs. Kaplan, how good a job do companies do now in terms of preparing themselves to against disinformation, and what kind of advice could you provide in this regard?
So I started this company in 2019, and it was way too early, and I got laughed out of a lot of conference rooms. I would say that what I'm seeing now is a lot of people have had something happen to them, and I would say the Fortune 1000, and interestingly, civil society, because if you think about who does Russia, China, and Iran hate, it's people who are trying to promote democracy globally, et cetera, are the ones who are now saying, okay, we've got a problem and we need to figure this out. What we are increasingly seeing is that it oftentimes, there are some people who are more proactive, and what we've identified is typically those individuals have either served in government, been journalists themselves, and have had to deal with these types of issues. But most of the time we get the phone call in the crisis, and by then it's oftentimes you're in damage control mode. Where we see companies be most successful is when they engage proactively, because the way that these attacks have really changed the game, I think especially for communications professionals, is the conventional wisdom used to be wait and see if it actually becomes a problem. And unless the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or CBC is reaching out to you, like, who cares? Keep it moving. The reality is we now live in a world where Gemini and Google results heavily rely upon Reddit data. So if you have a problem on Reddit, you have a problem with people trying to find things out about your company. Similarly, what we're seeing with websites and how that feeds LLMs, these junk news sites can increasingly tip the scales towards the adversary. And then the other thing that we're seeing is that we're not talking about enriched uranium here. Like, yes, this started as information operations in a war sense, but these are memes, and you can buy a bot network for $7 out of a vending machine in St. Petersburg. So I sometimes joke about what would we do if we did our powers to make jokes online and bring the internet back to what it was actually created for. But the reality is we see competitors do this to each other. We see financially motivated individuals trying to short stocks do this to each other. we're increasingly seeing the policy importance as we look at not just elections, but how are individuals, whether it's members of Congress or Parliament, influenced. Let's not ignore the fact that, influencers in the United States get a White House meeting and then all of a sudden half of NSA leadership is gone. Like, there are certain things like that where it's also a question of how are people building influence and what are they using it for? And what does this mean from a regulatory perspective on key issues that we are increasingly seeing companies start to focus on?
Carl, your bio said that you had some very interesting encounters during your career. You conducted investigations, and it says that you met with fake news merchant in Kosovo and hackers in Las Vegas. Can you talk about who are these bad actors, and is there a kind of evolution over time?
Well, the latest bunch of bad actors are people using assassination sites on the darknet. So if anyone wants to know more about that, then come and grab me afterwards. But I've always made it part of my job to actually really try and understand these kinds of dynamics from both sides, and it means that I spend quite a lot of my time trying to get to know and, in some weird way, establish trusted relationships with hackers and people that sit on the other sides of each of these kind of dialectics. And the answer is that of the people that fight, I view the world currently being shaped by the outcome of this conflict. I think if you see an information space as interesting only because in manipulating it you can achieve effects, I think that degrades the very idea of what information is in society. And I think anyone that works in academia or in journalism or is a writer or cares about the culture that we create, I think we sit on the other side of that competition. I don't think we can afford, as liberal democracies, to see information spaces as interesting only as effects-producing ecologies. We can't. Information is something that's intrinsically good, and it's something that we create all the time, and it's part of what it means to be human is to create these kinds of spaces. I see the bad actors essentially as being all the people that bring with them that kind of thinking, that kind of mentality and tradecraft that is interested in doing information warfare. And it's a long list. Lisa said there are for-profit actors, there are geopolitical actors. I think what's happening right now is that from around the noughties, militaries rewrote their operational doctrines to create information as a new space. I think they then built capability, and I think that's kind of pouring out into the private sector. In the same way that intelligence tradecrafts did a few decades before, I think exactly the same thing is now happening, where people have kind of built up the idea of doing this in a state, and now they leave the state, and they're like, hey, who's going to do it? Who's going to employ me? And it's beginning to be fought. It's being fought in the private sector. There's one group, though, that may be in the final dish in my smorgasbord of threat behaviors for you. Hopefully we'll have a bit of time to talk about solutions at the very end. But there's probably one group of bad actors that I do want to foreground. Has anyone heard of LLM grooming? I mean, I don't know why I can't see any of you. I presume probably not many. This, I think, is the new frontier, both in reputation protection and actually in information warfare. So there are actors now that are reverse engineering how LLMs are trained. They're trained, obviously, on tons of data, Reddit data, websites, as much of the internet as they can legally acquire. They also do something called RAG, which when you ask them something, they normally go out to the internet and bring back more information. Now, what companies are doing is they're trying to learn, well, what does the LLM actually pay attention to? Because it doesn't pay attention to everything in equal ways, actually. Like they actually do the same thing kind of as Google, where they try and kind of like understand where the main authority centers are. For instance, most of them do think that Reddit is a great way of like understanding what people really think. So they put a lot of emphasis on Reddit. And what these bad actors are doing is building their own systems, spinning up hundreds and hundreds of thousands of websites on a particular topic, trying to get those websites to look as authentic and authoritative as they can to change the responses that LLMs make. Now, they're doing this in a commercial way. So most of what they're saying, hey, this is just search engine optimization for LLMs. We're just doing the same thing for LLMs. So what they're doing commercially is to say, oh, yeah, you ask it what all the best price trainers are, and hopefully your brand can get in there. But can you imagine what would happen if that goes into state actors, or it goes into people that are deliberately trying to trash the reputation of a company? This training data, You know, we can't afford to ignore that now either. That's now becoming a matter, I think, of national security. And it's going to become a matter which every large company in the world that actually has an interface with consumers has to worry about as well. So that's another bunch of bad actors for us to deal with. But the list, unfortunately, is going to continue to grow. This is not a shrinking industry. Information warfare is something which is getting better and better and more powerful all the time.
Madame Bergeron, comme on vient de l'entendre, il y a une prolifération de la désinformation. Est-ce que vous pensez qu'on arrive au stade où il va falloir que les gouvernements pensent à légiférer?
Oui, sûrement. En tout cas, mieux nous aider à bien se protéger, je dirais. Je dirais aussi que les entreprises, je dirais les gouvernements, on a aussi une façon, on a un changement de culture dans la gestion d'une entreprise à transformer. Si on veut reprendre la confiance, il faut aussi redonner énormément de transparence à ce qu'une entreprise fait, à l'action d'une entreprise, à la gestion d'une entreprise. Ça va nécessairement, selon moi, aller avec. Alors, quand on a une action contre nous, contre un média, contre une personnalité, il faut agir extrêmement rapidement avec les outils qu'on a, mais avec la plus grande transparence. Et ça, je trouve les entreprises ne sont pas, on a de la difficulté à aller de l'avant vers ça, et ça va faire partie, selon moi, d'une solution dans cette transformation-là qu'on doit subir. Légiférer, ils ont tenté de légiférer avec C18. C18 a été extrêmement dommageable pour les médias. Et les retombées de ça, c'est que les gens, je l'ai dit un peu tantôt, vont chercher de l'information là où ils pensent que l'information est crédible. Ils pensent que c'est crédible. Et comme tout le monde est rendu un média, hein, vous êtes un média, M. Saint-Pierre, je suis rendu un média, j'ai ma communauté, j'ai mon groupe d'intérêt, je peux publier. Donc, ça vient faire en sorte que l'information crédible, elle est beaucoup plus difficile à trouver. Et moi, ce qui m'inquiète, à mon âge, c'est les plus jeunes. Parce que les plus jeunes, déjà, ils sont beaucoup plus ouverts. 4 personnes sur 10 sont plus ouverts au complotisme. Et quand on va chez les 18-34, on monte à 78% des gens qui consomment cette information-là, qui sont attirés vers une action complotiste. Alors, ce qui m'inquiète, c'est si les jeunes ne sont pas sur des sites crédibles d'information, leur information est erronée, leur réflexion est erronée par rapport aux enjeux d'une société, aux enjeux internationaux. Ça, je trouve que c'est inquiétant. Et légiférer, oui. Comment, je ne le sais pas.
Carl, if I may ask you the same question, which is, I was saying that we are seeing a proliferation of visual disinformation. In Europe, do you see more and more calls for governments to intervene more? And what would you predict is going to happen in the future?
Yeah, there's been a really decided shift away from this being the kind of purview of the culture ministry or the media ministry or the education ministry. And increasingly, at least in its sharpest forms, it's moved into the national security parts of government. And that means that there's more people with like cybersecurity backgrounds and counterterrorism backgrounds. If there's one big shift, and it's one that I've been calling for a long time, and I applaud, is to actually get after and disrupt and dismantle the specific campaigns that do this. Now, you know, there might well be people, and this is fine, that disagree with me on this, but I do not believe that we can educate hundreds of millions of people around the world to kind of spot, or even, frankly, to be particularly aware of a rapidly changing tradecraft that is both have massive commercial incentives behind it and is also being done by autocratic states. What we've got to do, like here in Canada, in the UK, like companies, civic society, and governments, is to inject as much chaos and error and friction and failure as we possibly can into these kinds of campaigns. To understand what they're doing, every single link of that kill chain, and understand what we can do to make their jobs so much more difficult, all the way from like degrading and denying their assets, no-fly lists, sanctions. And that's where I think we are today. And I don't think, I think it's mainly a coordination problem. I don't think we've yet worked out how all the different bits of society that actually care and want to try and protect information integrity, like how they all cooperate in that disruption. But yes, I do think that we will see on certain kinds of these kinds of influence campaigns, certainly the ones that say try and target in and corrode our kind of basic democratic norms and institutions, we will see like more interventions by governments in the year ahead. I think that's basically inevitable.
Lisa, would you give the American perspective on this?
I love your optimism. In the United States, we just had the Countering Foreign Influence Task Force evaporate. Most of CISA is on administrative leave or gone. And I know, at least from the American experience, I don't know if you've heard of this guy, Edward Snowden, but after those leaks and revelations came to light, there was the USA Freedom Act to reform the Patriot Act, which made it so that the US government cannot bulk collect social media data. And I don't think that we are comfortable, and that we ever have been, with democracies essentially having all of the social media data on its own citizens. And maybe we're comfortable with it in one administration, but not the other. And so I have found that government wants to do something when something illegal is happening, but is often not resourced to be able to do this. And this is where I think, and a lot of us working in this space kind of made the move over after really starting in CT or with an interest in terrorism. But we're not looking for the one person who's going to buy the plane ticket to go to Raqqa and train with ISIS, which is illegal, and then intercept them at the airport. We're looking for where are there mass campaigns that could potentially influence entire segments of the population to change their behavior, whether it's from the social engineering efforts that you were describing. But government is not resourced to be able to disrupt this. And so what we've, and I say this, I have yet to see a really good rapid fire government rapid response team be able to put out information as quickly as possible in a way that consumers will understand. So increasingly, we think of government as a stakeholder. If something illegal is happening, and then absolutely, give it to the government. They want to hear it. They want to know what's happening. They want to be able to do their jobs. But know that they're probably not seeing it unless it's affiliated with a known network that they have the authorities to track. Know that there's also a world in which culture eats strategy for breakfast, and many multinational corporations can work with multiple governments globally who care deeply about this issue. And then I find that companies and individuals are often on their own, and sometimes that includes like when they're working for the government. We've seen spokespeople get attacked with threats of violence against themselves and their families, et cetera, and there are sometimes resources to deploy. Oftentimes companies have to do that when it comes to their own staff. So I hate whole of society solutions because that means that nobody is in charge. But I think it's really a question of who has the incentive to do something based on what the risk being created is.
In terms of the people who are here in the room, if you had one piece of advice to give to them to help them prepare for the future, to protect themselves, what would it be? En commençant par vous, Madame Bergeron.
My God, éduquer, je dirais, le plus possible. Mais moi, je fais confiance à l'humain, en fait. Je dirais, le jour où je crois en l'intelligence artificielle, on voit des choses extraordinaires. Le jour où cette intelligence artificielle-là va pouvoir détecter tout ce qui est faux, ça va être vraiment, en tout cas pour un média comme le nôtre, ça va vraiment faire en sorte qu'on sorte du lot. Mais moi, je fais confiance en l'humain et puis il faut que les entreprises, par contre, se transforment extrêmement vite et qu'ils associent vraiment intégrité et transparence à leur gestion.
Carl, what would be your piece of advice?
Change your corporate structure. You're going to be treating information integrity like you treat cybersecurity in 5 to 10 years' time. Like, change how senior the person is that runs this. Like, make them answerable to the CEO, put them on the C-suite, and then make that person responsible for beginning to build whatever kind of company you are, the kind of disruptive and responsive capabilities that, in a world of information warfare, companies are unfortunately going to have to sail within.
And Lisa?
We predominantly work with the C-suite, so foot stomp that. It doesn't work if there's no corporate strategy at the C-level. Invest in early and proactive detection. You can't control when you get targeted, but you can control how early you find out and what you do about it, which gets back to play the game. The rules are changing. Completely agree that you got to fight fire with fire a little bit and learn new ways of working to actually be able to get out in front of this. But it is possible, and there are things that you can do in order to win against the adversary.
Well, thank you very much. It was a great discussion. Unfortunately, we just ran out of time. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Et puis maintenant, je suis très honoré de présenter un homme politique, un haut fonctionnaire français qui a eu une carrière remarquable. Et la bonne nouvelle, c'est que ce n'est pas terminé. Il a eu une carrière autant en France que sur la scène européenne. Il a été député du Doubs en 1997. Ça a été suivi de poste de ministre chargé des Affaires européennes entre 1997 et 2002 dans le gouvernement Lionel Jospin. Il a aussi été député européen à quelques reprises, ce qui l'a amené à être vice-président du Parlement européen de 2004 à 2007. Par la suite, il a été directeur de campagne de M. François Hollande lors de la campagne présidentielle de 2012. Il a été ensuite ministre de l'Économie, des Finances et du Commerce extérieur après la victoire de celui-ci dans le premier gouvernement Ayrault, puis ministre de l'Économie et des Finances au sein du second gouvernement Ayrault. En novembre 2014, retour sur la scène européenne alors qu'il est nommé commissaire européen aux affaires économiques et financières, à la fiscalité et à l'union douanière au sein de la commission Juncker, poste qu'il a occupé jusqu'à la fin de la législature en novembre 2019. Et en juin 2020, le président Macron l'a nommé premier président de la Cour des comptes, une fonction très importante puisqu'il s'agit de bien gérer les deniers publics. On sait aussi que la France a fait face à des problèmes sur le plan de la désinformation impliquant le président. Mesdames et messieurs, je vous demande de souhaiter la bienvenue à M. Moscovici.
Bien, mesdames, messieurs, chers amis, c'est un grand plaisir pour moi de revenir ici à cette conférence de Montréal à laquelle j'ai participé à plusieurs reprises depuis maintenant une quinzaine d'années. Je vais commencer mon intervention en français, qui est la langue que nous, Français, nous partageons avec le Canada et le Québec, et dont nous sommes si fiers, en remerciant les organisateurs de m'avoir invité à nouveau. Je voudrais axer mes quelques remarques autour des enjeux économiques et commerciaux dans une perspective qui m'est chère, qui est la perspective à la fois française, bien sûr, mais aussi européenne et transatlantique, en revenant aussi de quelques mots sur les conclusions de cette table ronde fascinante à laquelle j'ai assisté. Alors, à l'évidence, nous sommes entrés dans une nouvelle phase de l'ordre ou du désordre international, notamment du point de vue commercial, avec des bouleversements dont nous devons être conscients qu'ils ne sont pas temporaires et qu'ils auront des répercussions majeures, d'autant plus fortes si nous laissons faire. Les États-Unis, il faut prononcer tout de suite le mot, ont mis en œuvre une augmentation massive de 10 points de pourcentage des droits de douane sur la quasi-totalité des importations mondiales. Alors évidemment, ce n'est pas facile à suivre, tant les annonces du président Trump sont contradictoires, mais à mon avis, la chose la plus importante à retenir, c'est la suivante, qui est que la rhétorique de la réciprocité est de retour et qu'elle signifie en réalité un unilatéralisme déguisé. Évidemment, le Canada, qui est un voisin et partenaire stratégique, historique des États-Unis, est particulièrement concerné, puisque les relations commerciales entre les deux pays sont mises à rude épreuve. L'Union européenne, de son côté, sans être une cible principale, n'est pas épargnée. Les simulations estiment que nous pourrions avoir une perte d'environ 0,15 points de notre PIB de l'Union européenne, avec des impacts marqués de manière différente selon les secteurs. Je pense notamment au transport ou au secteur automobile allemand, par exemple. Les mesures prises par l'administration américaine ne sont pas seulement coûteuses, elles sont également fausses, fallacieuses dans leur inspiration. L'idée que ce sont les exportateurs étrangers qui vont supporter le poids des droits de douane est contredite par les données économiques. En 2018, c'était la première guerre commerciale entre les États-Unis et la Chine. Les importateurs et les consommateurs américains en vérité, ont absorbé la majeure partie des hausses de prix. Plus fondamentalement, nous assistons à un recul du multilatéralisme. Le système commercial mondial, qui a été laborieusement construit pendant 70 ans, est aujourd'hui menacé par une économie suffisamment importante pour agir seule. Je ne crois pas à la mort définitive du multilatéralisme, mais nous assistons sans aucun doute à un renversement d'alliance qui a non seulement des conséquences économiques évidentes et préoccupantes, mais qui remet en cause nos partenariats plus larges. Et nous devons en tirer toutes les conséquences. Et de ce point de vue-là, c'est le message que je voulais passer ici, l'Europe et le Canada ne peuvent pas se permettre d'être passifs. Nous devons réagir et agir ensemble. Ce qui veut dire qu'il faut une action coordonnée des deux côtés de l'Atlantique. En 2024, je vais parler de l'Europe d'abord, l'Union européenne a connu une croissance très modeste, de l'ordre de 0,9 points de PIB, avec des prévisions un tout petit peu meilleures en 2025, 1,5%, 1,8% pour 2026. Et donc nous avons une économie qui est vieillissante, avec une croissance lente, malgré nos très grandes forces. Et cette reprise est fragile. Elle est freinée par des tensions commerciales mondiales que nous connaissons, par toutes les incertitudes géopolitiques persistantes. En Europe, il y a la guerre en Ukraine, et l'Ukraine sait qu'elle peut compter à la fois sur le soutien de l'Union européenne et du Canada. L'inflation a maintenant baissé, grâce en partie à l'action de la Banque centrale européenne, qui a réduit son taux directeur à 2% en juin 2025. C'est la 8e baisse en un an. Et en comparaison, le Canada, on le sait, a connu une croissance beaucoup plus robuste, avec une expansion de 2,2 points de PIB au premier trimestre en 2025, plus haut que les prévisions. C'est notamment le résultat d'une augmentation des exportations, même si je sais que la demande intérieure reste fragile. Je voudrais citer, s'agissant de l'Europe, un rapport très important qui a été produit par Mario Draghi, ancien président de la Banque centrale européenne, ancien Premier ministre italien, qui dresse un diagnostic très précis de la situation économique en Europe et de nos défis. Ces défis, ils sont très lourds en vérité. Chez nous, le chômage reste encore élevé, autour de 9% de la population. Nous avons une population vieillissante, je sais que c'est le cas ici aussi, en tout cas au Québec. Nous avons un problème commun avec vous, qui est la faible productivité, et nous avons un problème que vous n'avez pas, c'est-à-dire une dette publique qui dépasse les 90% de PIB. Et donc, dans cette situation-là, ce que propose Mario Draghi, c'est de passer à l'offensive en investissant dans les infrastructures, notamment numériques et énergétiques, de soutenir l'innovation et la recherche, de favoriser une transition écologique inclusive, et il insiste aussi sur la nécessité d'être mieux piloté, de renforcer notre gouvernance commune. I would like to now follow up with English. And switching to English, I want to say a few words about Canada. From our perspective, Canada is clearly an underused trusted partner. Amid growing instability, Canada stands out as a country that is economically open, politically stable, strategically aligned with European values. The bilateral trade between, I concentrate on France and Canada, reached some 8.4 billion euros in 2023, marking a 34% increase since 2017. French exports to Canada amounted to 4.2 billion euros, with strong positions in fields like agriculture, pharmaceutical, aerospace. Meanwhile, Canadian imports to France matched that figure, driven largely by energy, metals, and raw materials. Bilateral investments between our two countries are important. In 2023, Canadian investments in France surged to over 16 billion euros, driven by strategic sectors like renewable energy, technology, and private equity. On the flip side, French investments in Canada totaled nearly 15 billion Canadian dollars in 2023, and major French corporations continue to play here a pivotal role in Canada's aerospace, pharmaceutical, and financial sectors. And Quebec alone accounts for almost half of that total bilateral trade, reflecting what we know, deep cultural and economic ties. These are not matched on numbers. But let's be honest. They are not transformational either, and they are not sufficient. Canada is only France's 28th largest export market, and that means that many French firms, especially SMEs, still overlook North America as a viable export destination beyond the United States. And this is obviously a missed opportunity. This is not something we can stand by. Our economic relationship must reflect our deeply rooted shared culture and vision of the world. Canada is well positioned to become, I'm convinced of that for a long time, for decades, a strategic hub for Europe in the Americas. More than a market, we could develop our relationship through joint R&D, raw material security, digital governance, green technology deployment. And the logic is simple. These are the few words I would like to say. As the US closes in, we need to open up. And we must do so with countries whose regulatory frameworks, environmental standards, institutional structures are totally compatible with ours. Between Canada and the EU, our ties are real. They are based on genuine trust, shared values, which I mentioned already, and a common project in favor of multilateralism, the fight against climate change and inequality and harmonious development while respecting our partners. And we need to work as closely as possible and quickly because time is running out. We must not think that this new geopolitical context is temporary. It is lasting and it will last. Our geopolitical awakening is indispensable and it means strengthening fast and strongly our mutual economic capacities. In this respect, defending our institutions is not a matter of formality. It is a matter of democracy, of resilience, and of trust. I strongly believe that multilateralism remains a key element in the service of the general interest. We know that it's under pressure worldwide, yet it is precisely through strong international institutions, I will mention the UN, the World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, WTO, that we can effectively respond to transnational threats, whether it's pandemics, climate change, or conflict. Of course, the UN are at the heart of this challenge. It happens that I'm now president of the Board of Auditors of the UN, which I will join in New York in 2 days from now. Defending the UN, therefore, is defending a fundamental pillar of international order and collective security. I was, as I said, fascinated by the roundtable before my short remarks. All the orators spoke very well about the absolutely central issue of misinformation. To combat this, my answer is the role of institutions. Institutions are treasures that we must cherish, preserve, defend. In particular, their independence is an indispensable asset in defending the rule of law. As Europe is challenged by illiberalism, we are very close to Russia, fake news, hybrid threats to our security, our institutions, starting with the European Commission, are building appropriate tools, and this is what we must reinforce. I would like to conclude by saying this. Our strategic awakening, as I mentioned, is as necessary as it is brutal, even if, in truth, it could have been better anticipated. War has returned to Europe's borders. Long-standing alliances are wavering, and also on defense. I saw the announces this morning by Prime Minister Carney, and I think he's right to do so. We must reinforce our defense and our spending in that sector. Trade tensions are rising, and this is a historical moment of choice. At this moment, the shared values, I talked about that twice already, democracy, the rule of law, open and fair trade, are being tested. But we also share the means to respond, the resilience of our institutions, the strength of our partnerships, the conviction that multilateralism remains our best compass. Et je termine en français. Notre objectif commun doit être de transformer ce moment de crise, de défi, en un moment de réinvention. L'incertitude à laquelle nous sommes confrontés sur le front économique, elle est réelle, elle est majeure. C'est aussi le cas sur le front politique, mais ça ne doit pas nous paralyser. Au contraire, je suis persuadé que plus que jamais, le Canada et l'Europe, avec en son cœur, naturellement, la France, ont un destin commun et des forums tels que celui-ci permettent de débaucher des réponses. Merci de votre attention. Je vous souhaite à tous des discussions riches et constructives autour de cette conférence qui est toujours remarquable.